Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning for our webinar. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us and join us to hear from Jamila Raqib from the Albert Einstein Institution. But before we hear from Jamila, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. I am the Senior Program Associate here at WAND, and I'll be running the back end of the webinar today. All of the attendees will be muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, please ask them using the question box in your attendee panel. If you type them in there, I'll see the questions, and then after Jamila finishes her presentation, I'll ask them aloud. And if you're having any technical difficulties, please contact GoToWebinar support directly. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tanya Henderson, WAND's Women, Peace, and Security Public Policy Director, to introduce Jamila. Tanya?
Good morning. Thank you, Leslie. I'm so excited with our guest speaker and new WAND partner, Ms. Jamila Raqib. She's the Executive Director of the Albert Einstein Institution, as Leslie mentioned. Ms. Raqib's organization, the Albert Einstein Institution, was founded in 1983 by Dr. Gene Sharpe. And since that time, it's been dedicated to advancing the study and use of strategic nonviolent actions in conflicts throughout the world. Actually, its founder, Dr. Sharpe, is widely regarded as the godfather of nonviolent revolution, and his scholarship has influenced resistance organizations around the world, from Zimbabwe and Serbia to Burma and Iran. His 93-page book, From Dictatorship to Democracy, is available on the internet online in 24 different languages, and most recently, it's claimed that the protest movements that toppled President Mubarak of Egypt drew extensively on his ideas, as well as the youth movement in Tunisia. So as a specialist in nonviolent action, Ms. Raqib has spent the last 10 years consulting with politicians and activists from around the world, seeking to improve their political systems based on Dr. Sharpe's research and methodology. And we're so lucky to have Ms. Jamila Raqib here with us today so she can introduce us to these techniques of nonviolent action and its role in preserving and extending democratic practices and human rights. So we'll get to enjoy a 30-minute presentation by Ms. Raqib, and then we can open up the webinar for a Q&A session. But what I want to highlight also here is, WAND's goal with this new partnership with the Albert Einstein Institution and Ms. Raqib is to really, continue to provide tools and resources for both our membership, our, grassroots activists, and our elected officials on how to continuing advancing our goal to reduce violence and militarism and build sustainable peace. So on that note, I just want to welcome Ms. Raqib and Jamila Raqib, and turn our conversation over to her for her to share with us this really transformative work. Jamila. Jamila, are you ready? We're looking forward.
Hello, are you there?
Yes, welcome.
Hi, sorry about that. Still getting used to all this technical stuff. Thanks very much, Tanya, for that introduction. It's great to be with you today. Thank you for being here, and thanks to our friends at WAND for hosting this webinar. My name is Jamila Raqib, and this is me. Well, I'm the one on the left. The gentleman that you see there is Dr. Gene Sharpe. Dr. Sharpe is regarded as the world's foremost authority on nonviolent struggle, which is a field of study and practice that is sometimes also referred to as civil resistance or people power. He's written for decades on the technique of nonviolent action, what it is, how it works, and how it can be used by groups struggling for a variety of social and political objectives. In 1983, he founded the Albert Einstein Institution in order to study nonviolent action and to develop writings and guides that could be helpful for people who were searching for a way to conduct their struggles effectively but without using violence. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the Albert Einstein Institution. And in those 30 years, I'm proud to say that the institution has played a major role in helping to spread these powerful ideas around the world. Today I'm going to talk about nonviolent action, what it is and how it works, and how it contributes to greater social and political empowerment. In many parts of the world, people are threatened by oppression and other serious problems and tragedies. They have a sense that their lives are determined by powerful forces that are and finally fatalism. Even in the country's democrat or powerless to even preserve their basic civil rights against erosion. Sometimes people complain that there's a general sense of apathy in their societies and that people just don't care about politics or social issues. Sometimes people who come to us looking for answers ask, can these people, the ones who appear to be apathetic, can they be made to care? How can people in their societies be engaged so that they stand up and take part in action that leads to real and lasting positive change? But much of what appears to people as apathy is not always that people don't care. It may actually be a mask for their feelings of helplessness. So if people feel there is nothing that they can do to change a situation, then they will see their problems as unsolvable and themselves as powerless. The truth is that ordinary people do hold great power, even if they don't realize it. This is the fundamental basis of our work and the idea on which this technique of nonviolent action is based. We call this concept power potential. This is the idea that every person has underdeveloped, hidden, and unfortunately often unrealized power. This unrealized power comes from the fact that what we do and how we behave and the extent to which we cooperate and obey the systems or people who determine the kind of society we live on, that through that obedience and cooperation, we give power to those systems and people. Without our obedience and cooperation, these systems and people cannot survive. This understanding can be massive for people who think that power in a society is in the hands of a select few and that there is nothing that they can do to change that, should that select few abuse that privilege. I've seen how massive that understanding, that shift in thinking about power can be through my own observations. About 2 years ago, during the revolutions in North Africa, there was a major breakthrough in media attention to our work, which meant that suddenly people from all over the world heard about our writings and resources. They called and wrote by the hundreds, sometimes every day, and visited our tiny office with questions and to share information about their situations and to give us feedback about our work. Letter after letter, person after person, from the 15-year-old Swedish student, how important it was for them to learn about our work, even just to learn that it exists, and that with they now had great hope that we're not as powerless as they previously were. Those of us working in the field don't need to be convinced of this work, but even I was amazed at the responses we received from regular people all over the world. Aha, I thought. These people are excited because they have taken the first step in transforming their theoretical, unrealized power potential to real. That's the type that is needed to actually produce change. That's now how we scale around the world for individuals and groups. Not perfectly, because it was improvised and spontaneous, and they didn't have access to the tools and resources that we now do. But despite that, they had great effectiveness and important successes. That's very empowering. When people learn how to act effectively, and they observe that the people responsible for some of the most important changes in the history of the world had no greater capacities than them, that they were not perfect saints or martyrs, but ordinary people like most of the rest of us, they begin to realize their own power. Learning about what others have done reveals possibilities that are therefore also available to them, provided that they think carefully, plan wisely, and act courageously. People learn that having a wise plan greatly increases their effectiveness, and that thinking and studying is a prerequisite to developing that plan. They learn about the factors that increase their chances of success and those that can lead to defeat. They learn that they must study their situation, their strengths and weaknesses, and those of their opponent, that they must become experts in this technique, learn how and why it works when it succeeds, and learn why it fails when it does not. They now know that they can learn how this technique works by studying the writings and tools that Gene Sharpe and a number of other important people in the field have spent decades researching. They know that people are working on improving the technique and that they also can contribute to that effort so that others can fight for the issues that they care about. So how does this technique actually work? You might be surprised to learn that it doesn't depend on your ability to be good or moral or have a certain belief system. Nonviolent struggle is actually based on a human quality that fortunately comes quite naturally to most of us, and that's the quality of human stubbornness. So it's human stubbornness which is applied to social, economic, and political issues. It works by using your ability to dissent, so to defy and to disrupt, in order to defend and fight for your political and social objectives. In other words, people do things that are forbidden to do, and they refuse to do the things that they're told to do. And if they do that in accordance with a wise plan that has been calculated based on a good understanding of this technique and detailed knowledge of their own problems and issues, they have a greater chance of achieving their goals. To oppose foreign occupations, to defend the rights of minorities, of women, freedom of all kinds. The technique does not require a particular belief system. Our research shows that people have chosen to use this type of struggle instead of violence. It's been a rational choice. So they did it for pragmatic reasons, because they thought it would raise the chances that they would win their objectives, and because they understood. An important study by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan compared the outcomes of 320 and nonviolent campaigns between the years of 1900 and 2006. They published the results in their 2011 book titled Why Civil Resistance Works. They found that the campaigns were non-objectives, 50 for violence. In other words, the evidence shows that nonviolent struggle has been about twice as effective as violence. So the decision has most often been strategic. People use nonviolent types of action because they were outmatched militarily, or because nonviolent means are viewed as more democratic and legitimate, and that they therefore would more likely appeal to their potential allies within the society or internationally. Obviously a complex struggle, but we'll just go through some of the fundamental action. First, people have taken part in symbolic protests. These include such methods as marches, vigils, distributing leaflets, wearing specific colors or symbols to communicate that you support or oppose some specific policy or objective. Symbolic methods are most often associated or sometimes even equated with this technique, because these are often the types of activities that we see on our television screens. But while they can be important, they're actually considered mild compared to the next two categories, the methods of non-cooperation and intervention, which are the most powerful for bringing about change. People have sometimes refused to cooperate with certain practices, and this is called non-cooperation. Historically, this has taken social, economic, and political forms. Social non-cooperation are social boycotts. So for example, people refuse to participate in observances or celebrations, or to attend meetings or schools that they believe support their opponent or promote some policy that they disagree with. Sometimes with their opponent. So they've refused to supply or for goods and services. Economic labor strike, symbolic work, single factory strike, rural strike, or even an economic shutdown of a city or country. Political non-cooperation includes boycotts of elections, rejection of the legitimacy of a regime, non-obedience without direct supervision. That's when people slow down or stop work by government employees, or civil disobedience of so-called quote, immoral laws. The last category is nonviolent intervention. This is when, in extreme cases, people have used intervention and disruption of the normal operation of the system, which has taken psychological, social, economic, physical, and political forms. There is a category of method, including the occupation of offices, sit-downs in the streets, hunger strikes, new social practice of administrative facilities. The individual methods method on being added all people into new technologies to internet, and so I'm amazed at the and innovation that increasingly. Let's look at the flamenco protests that are based in Spain to protest measures put in place by the Spanish government. So here's how it works. Angry citizens or being forcibly removed by bank security. As one commentator put it, being outside in the cold with shouting slogans at the 20th century. The group responsible is called Low 6x8. They have a video tutorial posted on their website for the flamenco protesters with lyrics and music which people can use and then tailor the protest to their individual styles. Here's a quote from one of the members of the group. And then invert the order of things. We demand attention and say, here we are, using our bodies to fight the financial system. Now we know that the performances on their own are not going to completely transform the Spanish banking system or solve every problem related to the current financial crisis. But what these protests have achieved is important. They've created an outlet for political expression and allowed people to express their discontent without resorting to violence. They've gotten the authorities' attention, and they've shown people that they're not powerless. The idea that you use a culturally important symbol, in this case flamenco music, one that's historically been linked with the expression of social and political realities, is clever. People recognize that co-opting and using these symbols conveys the seriousness of their grievances. It places their issues in a historical context, and it communicates the social, political, and economic values that they support rather than just what they're against. Also, they're creating what we call a dilemma action. By using an important cultural symbol, people are forcing their opponent, in this case the bank, to use police and security guards to expel them from their property and to look foolish and unjust while doing so. In terms of the public perception of the action, it's certainly more effective than vandalism or violence. After one performance, the group obviously the availability of new technologies and social media has opened up new possibilities in terms of how people communicate, access information and tools, and broadcast their information about their activities into the world. Long stream their activities or demands or whatever they wish to share with the world. Social media also reducing atomization societies. Atomization is the idea of each citizen in a society an isolated unit without the connections that enable collective action. In other words, if you think you're the only person who's angry about a particular abuse or policy, you may feel powerless to do anything about it. Though we usually refer to atomization when speaking about extreme dictatorships, it's important to remember that atomization of societies can occur even under other systems of government. Even in countries that are more democratic, people might think that they're powerless, that they're the only ones who hold particular views or grievances. Online technologies like Facebook and Twitter can show you that you're not alone and maybe embolden you to take steps to fight to change existing conditions. But these tools don't tell you what to do or replace the need for real study and planning. Nonviolent action can also include legal or institutional channels, including elections or court cases. However, when institutions fail or are inadequate, or elections are neither free nor fair, people have turned to nonviolent actions to make their views known and to bring about change. walkouts of senates and parliaments around the world seem to be the method of choice for many legislators. Senator walked out restrictions on women's health care. My own conservative so close to these controversial. Quote, "We stood together to protest feel is absolutely a woman here in Georgia and to sound the alert to Georgians," quote. The protest achieved what it set out to do. Were alerted to the fact that important decisions that negatively impacted their choices and the person being made in the Georgians around the country. Nonviolent action can provide a powerful way to deal with a very dangerous and harmful tendency that exists not just in the world's worst dictatorships, but in all societies. And that is the tendency to centralize political power and to ignore or give inadequate attention to human rights, civil liberties, and democratic practice. Some societies that are not truly democratic but which have basic superficial appearance of democratic rule may provide no way for disadvantaged or weaker sections of their population to make their views heard and to struggle for their objectives. Well-planned nonviolent struggle is more likely than any other means to achieve durable, positive change that is lasting. This is because the technique operates by distributing power throughout society in two different ways. First is the use of nonviolent struggle creates and strengthens independent institutions that are outside of the control of the state. These institutions or groups can be bases of organized activity to deal with future threats. Second is the population becomes experienced in the application of this type of action that can then potentially be used against any present or future oppression or threat. One of the most compelling stories I've ever heard that illustrates this is from apartheid South Africa. During one of the major phases of the struggle, it seemed to the leaders of the struggle that it was impossible to mobilize the population to take part in action against the apartheid system. So what they did was to create civic organizations whose job it was to pick up on specific issues that were affecting people's lives and to struggle for limited changes on these everyday issues. The people in one village were always getting sick from drinking polluted water, and they decided to campaign to force the government to build a well to provide them with clean water. On that single issue, the people acted and won. So they didn't call for the removal of the apartheid system that was largely responsible for the injustices that they faced in their lives. Instead, they focused on the issue of clean water. They campaigned to get a well, and they won their objective. Through their own action, they became empowered, gaining confidence that they could achieve larger goals. The campaign for clean water had important consequences in terms of mobilizing people's efforts on building their confidence and establishing the networks that were used as a basis of action for the wider anti-apartheid struggle. The lesson is that when struggling against great oppression that seems overwhelming, it's often wise to organize around a more limited, specific expression of the large problem, an issue that is obviously justified, has significant popular support, and which is therefore achievable. When we are a lone voice protesting on our own and expressing our grievances, we can be more easily dismissed and ignored, and with coordinated plan begins system. That is also, we can expect a reaction from one that in order to help avoid that. So I'll end by saying that, of course, conducting a struggle isn't simple or safe. But as we all know, struggling for what is important is often difficult and risky. The good news is that developing strategies that have a chance of working is within our capacity. The tools to do it successfully exist. They're being improved and refined and innovated every day by people such as yourselves. So that's all I have. I look forward to your questions and also to our in-person discussion in a few weeks. So thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Jamila. I really appreciate that. That was a really great and informative presentation. I know our audience has lots of questions for you, but before we start taking them, I just want to go ahead and remind everyone how to submit questions. There is a question panel that should be on the right-hand side of your screen. And please type your questions below.
Great, thank you.
And so our first question is from Jamila Raqib. And Miriam asks if you could comment illiterate, disenfranchised, culturally and politically fragmented, and living under decades of foreign occupation as well as the will of a brutal internal government. How might this society avoid further atomization and affect positive change?
That's a great question, Miriam, and I think it's one that we receive quite often. I think the important thing to remember is that you have to think big but actually start small. And I think that's what the South Africa story was meant to communicate. It's the idea that if your objective is a complete change in your political system, perhaps that's not realistic to achieve immediately in your first campaign. That is your vision of tomorrow. It's what your population is struggling for, and it may be your stated goal. But that right now you have to focus on an issue that is more limited. It's more limited in terms of geographic area, and it's more limited in terms of type of issue. It can be political or economic, and oftentimes it is the sort of bread and butter issues that have widest popular support because failed them, the government has failed them when they can't, for example, feed their children or basic services or healthcare. Organizing around those issues that are both have popular support and achievable can really get people mobilized in a way that gets their feet wet in political change. And so that's sort of what we advise. I think also trying to disseminate the knowledge of this type of struggle, sharing with people what has happened throughout history. In Afghanistan, for example, you know, this is a population that is highly fragmented. War, really, in many ways, quite whatting for people, thing for them. It's decades ago, in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, there existed a really powerful movement called the Khudai Khidmatgar. And the Khudai Khidmatgar were a political movement that started as a social movement that existed, took place in that sort of frontier area, so the border between Afghanistan. And what were considered previous people were mobilized based on basic issues, volunteerism, on you know, uniting against a common enemy. That common enemy happened to be the British rule in the area, and that illiterate population, populations that were cut off, educated, did not know how to read. There were a lot of problems that existed. As we said, we must have the Pashtun. What I think this really is that even physically weak people can be mobilized. And I think that knowledge of what has happened, even in their own region throughout history, that's what I've learned in sort of trying to distribute the information, Khudai Khidmatgar and Afghanistan. That history is lost not just but also to people of that region. And I think they greatly benefit from what's happened in their region throughout history. And so I think that spreading the stories, spreading knowledge of this, how it works, diffusing power, diffusing that knowledge, communicating the idea of non-cooperation, I think those things are very empowering, that those things can be very effective even in societies that are highly fragmented. Thank you for your question.
Thank you for such a thorough answer. That was a good kickoff. Our next question is for Ilana asks, can you speak to the difference between empowerment and power itself. Research suggests that empowerment reflects the giving of power from the top down, but some other research says that power is internal and neither given nor destroyed, but a gift to be developed. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. Well, our understanding of political power is the sort of fundamental bit about this work, and it's really the most sort of enlightened piece about this, I think, for most people. I think it's the idea that power is inherent to our rulers, to our systems. It's not as if people are born with this power in and of themselves. They're actually given that power voluntarily by individual institutions in their society, and that nonviolent struggle where it's sort of withdrawing or withholding or completely cutting off those sources of power. So our understanding of political power is based on an understanding of history, how it actually works. So this is not sort of how we want the world to work, but in actually how it actually does. And we think that, our research shows that power is voluntarily given, and that therefore it can be withheld, and that it's not inherent to our rulers. It actually exists in these so-called, in civil society, in what we call loci of power. These are the places in society where power resides. So it's it's not just in all the places we might think, like, WAND, for example, or, other organizations, but actually even in religious institutions, cultural institutions, and even gardening clubs or reading clubs. These are networks of people that exist for a particular purpose, and that purpose can be then shifted, should be another need, like a political need or a social need. So we have think of power, and I think one that is really based on a realistic understanding of the world. I'm sorry, I may not have answered your question perfectly. If I didn't, please come back with a response. But just in case I didn't understand you.
No, that sounded pretty thorough to me, actually.
Great.
So our next question is from Libby Dickerson, and Libby says, you listed the creation of new economic institutions as an example of political intervention. Can you speak more about that strategy?
Sure. So I'm sorry, it's specifically economic institutions that you're interested in?
Yes, the creation of new economic institutions as an example of political intervention.
Great, yes. So what I'm going to do is point you to some literature which can probably do a much better job at explaining that, about how that's actually operated throughout history. So we have various books. One of them is called The Methods of Nonviolent Action. It's the middle volume of a three-volume book called The Politics of Nonviolent Action. And in this volume is what it does is take the 198 methods and define each of the methods, and also explain how it has been used throughout history. And so development of other economic institutions is a particular method that is described in that book. I don't know much about it, but what I've heard is that even more recently, in the sort of, as a sort of offshoot of the Occupy movement. And perhaps one of the listeners knows more about this than I do, and could share information about that, that there were organizations created, which I'm afraid I don't know the name of the organization, but which did seek to buy up debt and then forgive particular loans so that people would be able to avoid foreclosure and therefore avoid losing their homes. And so I think that's a really powerful model, which I've heard is a sort of recent case. But as I said, these cases have been documented throughout history, and there's probably a series of other examples that you can look up yourself in either the Methods of Nonviolent Action or in other places online.
Thank you. Our next question is from Madeline Claire Powell. And Madeline asks, any recommendations on how to connect the dots between global change and health impacts on the poor? And then she specifically references the nuclear power plants and coal facility in Georgia as well. And how to observe these facilities pull out, scaring them, overwhelming them, or leaving them feeling hopeless?
That's a great question, Madeline, and a good nonviolent means have been very effective in paying attention to environmental issues and have prevented and stopped the expansion of those industries and New England that you can learn more about. I think that the basis of this work is that with particular objectives, that struggling for particular objectives requires a plan, and that the plan may involve several different campaigns of struggle. The first one may be in informing the population of the risks and dangers posed by different industries or coal plants or nuclear power plants, etc. And that how to formulate those campaigns in a way that can lead to greater effectiveness is possible, and that that requires a lot of information on the issues. That's information that you have, though, information that I don't have. And so prescribing remedies for specific problems is not something that we're able to do. But the information is there for people to get extremely educated about the issues and the threats posed to the population, and who are the stakeholders, and how might they be not exactly moved to sort of change, but actually coerced to change or forced to change and forced to give up their plans on building these plants. How might that happen? And that requires a really, really detailed understanding of the issues that I don't have.
Well, that was a good start, I think. Our next question asks, do you agree that women can take on a larger role in all these types of nonviolent activities? And do you have any examples of this happening, perhaps on a larger scale than the dancing in Spain?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm sorry it wasn't addressed in the presentation, because it's and I sort of assume it goes without saying that women have historically played a huge role, not just in participating in these struggles, but also in sometimes leading them. And so I think that's really important to recognize that, of course, women have very important roles in the future as well. I think that nonviolent types of struggle, as opposed to violence, as opposed to terrorism or that type of activity, nonviolent means actually not just allow for participation by women, but really depend on it. That for it to work well, it's got to have the contributions of all segments of society, and that includes women. And not just women, but also people who are not sort of young, able-bodied men. I mean, that's the type of demographic that takes part in violent conflict. But nonviolent means have really employed the efforts and energies of all kinds of people, older people, even handicapped people, people with disabilities, women, even young people and children. So I think that's sort of fundamental to the sort of theory, but that's based on really how it's operated historically. Women, and I'll give you an extreme example, because many people think that Muslim women are generally oppressed, and that they are really their area is the home, and that they're not going to be involved in political affairs, especially not historically, and especially not in that region in Afghanistan and Pakistan. But in the Khudai Khidmatgar movement that I earlier mentioned, women participated very heavily. In fact, there was a sort of ranking system in the movement, and women held important ranks in that movement, and they were involved in planning, and they were involved in developing the campaigns. They were involved in also developing some of the educational programs and the training that were designed to involve other parts of the population. So that's really key. And also in the Indian independence movement, women were heavily involved. And I would say that we could keep going. Women have been involved in the color revolutions. They've been involved more recently in the revolutions in North Africa. I think women are involved everywhere, and that contributes to a stronger movement. And we have to make sure to involve women. We have to make sure that this knowledge is available to them. And I think that's one part of why I'm really pleased to be taking part in this webinar and to the workshop in a few weeks.
Thank you. Our next question is from David Sierra Lupe. David asks, is the internet a game changer? The digital age creates massive privacy concerns. Does the internet's democratizing power counterbalance the opportunity for governmental overreach?
So I actually just went to a sort of meeting conference with some of the key technologists in Silicon Valley to discuss this question. So it brought together some of the key people in the field of technology and also in nonviolent struggle to discuss how the internet and some of the new social media and the technologies were assisting efforts for democratization, and also how repressive regimes and governments were using technology to better surveil their citizens and to keep track of what people were doing, and to therefore undermine and stop what they were doing. So I think that the internet has been hugely helpful. I know this in my own work. I know about sort of the spread of the material. So Gene Sharpe's writings, for example, is specifically what I deal with, and the way in which they were disseminated or distributed in past years before the existence or availability or wide-scale availability of online media. Like before that, they happened incrementally. So activists would meet each other, and they would travel, and they would pick up the book. Someone would see it in a bookstore window and then take it to a different country. And that's how it happened. And it happened pretty efficiently. I mean, books were still spreading in, something like 10 languages or something like that. Excuse me, not just 10 languages, 10 languages just for that one book, From Dictatorship to Democracy. But then I noticed the sort of decade that I've been involved in this work has also coincided with the huge exponential increase in the availability of these technologies. And I have seen also an exponential spread in this work. So I think that even in just access to information, access to the tools that can make what people are doing already more effective, that is being greatly helped by the internet. But you'll notice I said what people are already doing, right? So these tools, they don't actually instigate the action. They actually facilitate it. So I think that they are tools of communication. They are extremely important. They give people the ability to sometimes circumvent government control. They also allow for meeting or for carving out political space in places where that doesn't exist. And I think we can all think of examples of those types of societies. And therefore it's clearly very important. But what we have to remember is, first of all, that they don't replace the need for clear thinking. They also are tools that can be used by our opponents. And so I think that we have to understand that they are not foolproof, that when you're in your home typing away and you have this perception that you're alone, that actually, Big Brother could be watching, and that can produce and really present a type of vulnerability that can cause some serious problems. And we've seen examples of that, and I'm sure you guys know about some of those, about arrests and repression that comes specifically from using the internet and social media.
Well, speaking of social media, a few people have asked about that. Can you elaborate a little bit more about the role of social media in driving and building nonviolent campaigns?
Sure, I can try to do that. I'm definitely not an expert. In fact, I just set up a Twitter account not not too long ago, maybe a year or so, and I've sent something like 300 tweets, which is absolutely shameful. And people are encouraging me all the time to sort of speak out more because I think it is a powerful tool. But it's not sort of the basis of my work or anything that I'm really good at. But I think other people know far more than I do, and there's a great deal of new work on this topic about how campaigns get organized through using social media. The only thing I would say, what I can say is that, that the online organizing does not replace the need for offline organizing and action. And that oftentimes, you build a big campaign, and there's an example of this where people were, they were protesting a raise for Finnish parliamentarians. I really hope I got this right, or otherwise I've just spoken out against Finnish parliamentarians. I think that's what it was. They were protesting this raise. And so they organized a Facebook page, which got like 100,000 likes, which, that's a big deal. And so they, based on that, they organized an action. And I guess people liked it again, and they said they were going to show up. But when it came time for that action, it was like 12 people that actually showed up. And so, I think that really communicated that that they needed to have done a bit more work on really establishing those connections a bit more, so that people were not just sort of clicking like, but actually were more invested in, therefore would contribute more and actually participate in a real way, not through their computers. But anyway, as I said, lots of people are giving this their attention. There's some really, really important tools. There's organizations that are dealing with this, and so I advise you to seek them out.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Senator Nan Orrock, and she says, if you're familiar with Moral Mondays underway in the North Carolina state capital city of Raleigh, what lessons of your presentation are reflected there?
Well, Nan, I am embarrassed to say that I haven't heard about that action, but I look forward to learning more about it, or perhaps there's something you can tell me about it now. Otherwise, I'd be happy to look into that, and we can speak more offline.
All right, we'll have to have you follow up with that one. Let's see. Our next question is asking, why do you think nonviolent protests have been largely unsuccessful today after the early success of the Tunisian Spring?
Yeah, great question. There's a number of things I can say about this. A lot of people are asking that, and I think it's really important that we get this clear so that failures of movements do not signify that there's something inherently wrong with this technique and that it doesn't work. First of all, nonviolent struggles have been hugely effective in the Arab Spring. There are cases where, certainly, obviously, in Syria, for example, where very powerful nonviolent movements then were shifted. So the means of struggle used were shifted from nonviolent means, which were having great successes in really causing the large numbers of defections, for example, from the Syrian military and from the Syrian political system. And then the shift happened where, there was extreme repression. So people were using nonviolent struggle, there was repression, and then the movement basically fell apart in response to that repression. So our work assumes that when you present a serious challenge to a regime that is willing and has the capacity to use repression and violence, that they will do so. That nonviolent struggle leaders have to plan repression, and that they have to try to figure out how to make that repression backfire. And so there are principles within this technique. One of them is political jiu-jitsu, in which the repression is made to backfire on the regime. And those kinds of sort of mechanisms and how to make them work are really important to study. And the planning is really key so that when that repression happens, that it doesn't cause a shift to violence or a collapse in the movement, that it actually causes that backfire that I just talked about. So obviously the situation is very complex in Syria, and I think I'm not a Syria expert, but I think that what appeared to be a very powerful struggle then, because it was shifted to violent means, therefore really caused a lot of the problems that we see today, and also a huge rise in casualties. So I think using mainly symbolic methods like protests, like demonstrations, is risky. When you're facing a regime like the Syrian regime, I think using those symbolic methods, which, as we said before, are actually less powerful and more risky, because you have regular civilians facing a regime's troops that are willing to use violence, and I think that's why you see those high rates of casualties. And I think with those rates of casualties, I think it's very hard to maintain a nonviolent struggle movement. That what needed to happen, I think, was a shift from the sort of symbolic methods of protest to some of the more powerful methods of non-cooperation. So these are weakening the economic system, that, trying to figure out how to encourage defection, so weakening the police, weakening the military, figuring out what it is in society that gives the regime power, and then destabilizing that and working on weakening or severing those links. And I think that was not done. So I think we need to be really careful in how we kind of assess failure. I think that failure is a result of a lack of planning, not an indication that nonviolent struggle cannot work, or could not have worked in that situation. And I think the same is the case with many of the other struggles that you see. I think that we need to be careful about also assessing something a failure when it's still in progress. So there are struggles taking place that are continuing. And then I think people learn not just from successful movements, but also from mistakes, and that there are ways in which people are learning and innovating, and these struggles will continue. I predict that maybe we're going to see some surprising changes in the coming years.
Thank you. I think that's definitely an important distinction to make. I think we have time for just one or two more questions, and our next one is from Senator Sandy Pappas. Senator Pappas asks if you're familiar with Nonviolent Peace Force, and if they're using intervention techniques, and have they been effective?
Yes, I am familiar, but only in that I know the name, and I've met some of the participants and people in that organization. But I couldn't comment on their effectiveness or on their activities, I'm afraid. I think that as a form of sort of solidarity, and not just solidarity, but as the senator said, as a form of intervention, bringing basically, if I understand it correctly, internationals to a conflict area to kind of bear witness, not just bear witness, but also to serve as a deterrent for violence against human rights defenders. I think it can be effective, and I think as a component of a larger strategy in which people themselves on the ground are in charge, I think it can be effective. Relying on that alone, relying on internationals alone, is something that makes me, frankly, uneasy. So I think as a component of a larger strategy, that's really, really important, but only as that component, not as a sort of primary piece of the action.
This is going to be our last question, because we are almost out of time. At the end of your informative presentation, you noted that when engaged in nonviolent resistance, we prepared for the existing structures to react or respond to our resistance efforts. Can you provide some examples of how to prepare for reactions to resistance?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, I think understanding that it's going to happen, right, and not letting that paralyze you is really important. Knowing that the repression is likely to happen and preparing for it can go a very long way in kind of allowing people to accept risk. I mean, I'm amazed at this all the time about how brave people are, but I think it's really important to be brave, and you know, there's a huge role that that plays in nonviolent struggle. But I think it should be calculated. And I think understanding what's going to happen and what to do, for example, when you are arrested, what to do to how the leadership structure works, so that when one person is arrested, that there, you know, that there are ways for other people to sort of take over, that there are other people that are then mobilized to do something, like call lawyers, like head to the prison, like make sure that they raise the alarms in the international community using social media or other methods. I think those can be really important for people, just sort of psychologically. I think understanding that protests can be met with violence is important, how to prevent that, how to maintain nonviolent discipline on the part of the protesters so that you don't instigate violence, and also the types of repression used. I mean, a lot of people are surprised sometimes, and they shouldn't be, to find that regimes and governments sometimes put agents into resistance movements in order to not just provoke resistance violence, but actually to commit it. So they have people committing violence on the part of the resistance movement in order to instigate that repression. So figuring out how that works, that happens, that they should watch for it. So they should watch for it so that they can prevent a kind of shift to violence, that they can prevent that kind of repression. I think that is really important. And also understanding that that oppressors are going to threaten and they're going to punish those who disobey, who strike, you know, who refuse to cooperate, but that repression and even brutality don't always produce submission. So they don't produce necessarily cooperation that allows the regime to function. Actually, regime repression can initiate that process that we talked about, the political jiu-jitsu, and that can rebound and weaken an oppressive system. So I think maintaining nonviolent discipline in face of repression and how you do that is really key in that case, and I think planning helps to do that. Acting with others helps to reduce fear, to prepare for repression, and you know, and also making sure that you know that those high-risk methods are risky. That perhaps there's things you can do, like a stay-at-home strike. So you don't face the repression head-on. You actually just you know, emptying the streets and sending a message to your opponent that you're the one that has the power. You know, so using these sort of extremely high-risk methods are not necessarily the most effective, and that sometimes that repression could cause a collapse, and you want to avoid that. But casting off the fear or controlling it is also really closely tied with gaining confidence. So understanding that the power that you possess and that you can actually act effectively to change your situation, that really helps in reducing the fear. And that fear can also be removed in stages. And that participating in a struggle, historically that's what we've seen help to do that. So acting with others helps to reduce fear.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you to you, Jamila, for that really, really great presentation and for you know, such a good question and answer session. And I also want to say thank you to all of our attendees who joined us for this webinar. We really appreciate your participation. And we also look forward to hearing your feedback. We'll be sending you a feedback survey tomorrow afternoon by email, and we appreciate any comments that you can provide to us so that we can continue to improve upon our webinar program. Once again, thank you so much to everyone for joining us, and we're going to sign off.
Great. Thank you so much, Betsy, and thanks to all of you for your time.